My son's new hobby is scaring the hell out of me. My son got really into cataloging nature during the pandemic. He'll literally walk around our yard and the woods behind our house and write down what he sees, trying to describe all the plants and animals, even though they already have names I know, like a little naturalist. Especially during the spring last year when all the birds and the bees started returning to the area after winter, he really got into it. I think it's a combination of his science teacher that he loves, Mrs. Feltman, and the fact that lockdown forced him to stay home. That's when he started noticing more things about the change of seasons, the fun critters that live in our yard, everything. As a parent, that part has been the absolute best. Seeing him really connect with nature in that way and not just sitting on the couch and staring at whatever episode of Cartoon Network is on. He started out just keeping tabs on whatever flowers I had in the garden and whatever cool bugs he found in the corners of the garage, but soon he became really fixated on this gopher in the backyard. At first I thought it was really cute. I don't know much about gophers, but my son seemed to really be able to get up close and personal with this one. It also seemed to be pregnant, at least that's what I thought, since its belly was so huge. So I was even more taken aback that it wasn't aggressive or territorial when my son would literally just run up to it. That should have been red flag number 1. But something weird started happening. I was reading through one of my son's animal books, half out of curiosity and half to see what he was reading, and I found that the book had a whole section on animal myths and legends. One entry was about skinwalkers, an old Navajo belief that there's a type of witch who can take the form of animals, and at first I just thought it was pretty interesting. But a few days later, I started to notice more and more weird behaviors that the gopher did that became kind of suspicious. I've always been superstitious, and my husband makes fun of me for it, but I swear this gopher was way too comfortable around my son, especially if she was pregnant. He would play with the gopher, and I swear it literally came to the door once looking for him. And the gopher would let him chase it all over the yard. My biggest scare came one day when the gopher lured my son out of sight. And when I say lured, I mean lured. I mean, it ran past the house looking for him. And then when he saw it and ran out to play with it, the gopher just darted off behind the shed. And I couldn't see where they went. When my son didn't reemerge for a few minutes, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I dropped what I was doing and bolted behind the shed to see what was happening. To my horror, I saw my son trying to squeeze himself under the shed and into the gopher's hole. I yanked him back and asked him why he wanted to go down in that muddy, filthy hole, and he said, "Because she wanted me to. She wanted me to see her house." When I asked him who told him that, he pointed down the hole to where the gopher had just entered. I pulled him back into the house and told him he was not allowed to go behind the shed like that again without me, ever. I know I was maybe overreacting a bit, but that's how freaked out I was. But this isn't the end of the story. The event that makes me lose sleep at night happened like a month later. One day I heard rustling over by the shed. I didn't think much of it at first. I kind of smirked, thinking, oh good, maybe something's getting the gopher. But then I immediately felt bad for thinking that. It was my son's favorite animal, after all. So in a moment of sentimental stupidity, I went outside to try and fend off whatever was attacking the gopher. And that's when I saw it. An old, decrepit woman, completely naked and covered in dirt, was standing next to the gopher hole. I gasped and dropped the coffee mug I was holding. I didn't know whether to run away or try to help the poor woman. But she smiled at me and slowly lifted her finger and pointed it at me. That was it. I ran back inside the house and called the police. They said they'd be right on their way with an ambulance to pick up the woman. They took her away, but as the car slowly passed by our house, she kept staring at the house, at all of the windows, like she was trying to find someone. I don't know if she was a skinwalker or not, but I can tell you confidently that we have never seen that gopher again. Looking back on what I'm about to tell you, I'm reminded now of stories my grandfather told me about his childhood on the Iowa farm in the early decades of the last century. It must have been somewhere around the 1930s when men rode horses across fields and had to do long hours of back-breaking work in the fields. He used to tell me about dogmen, dog-like men who were half man, half dog that roamed the cornfields in rural Iowa during the harvest season. The dogmen would come out at night and terrorize people in their sleep by scratching on doors, howling at windows, and even stealing their food. I'm not sure if he ever saw one himself or if he heard the dogmen from others who had seen them. As a teenager growing up in rural Iowa today, I still hear stories of dogmen roaming the cornfields at night, but I never really believed any of it until it happened to me. It was a Saturday night in July of 2015, and a few groups of my friends had come over to our farmhouse to hang out on the porch. We were basically geeky-type kids that didn't get into much mischief. In fact, some of us didn't even want to do it, but one friend in the group dared us all to walk through the cornfields. You see, it was a moonless night that night and super dark. We could really only see shadows, which made the thought of a corn walk even scarier. Most of us ended up doing it reluctantly. At around 10 o'clock at night, we all walked into the cornfields. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing, coming up with all kinds of scenarios of something or someone that would come pouncing out on us. And then I knew something was wrong as soon as it moved. The movement was off to the side where none of us were walking, and it was loud. In retrospect, I can guess that it must have been the fact that no animal would willingly move towards a large group of humans making all sorts of noise, and yet there it was, bearing down on us from out of nowhere. That's what made me freeze. Perhaps if we had spotted it in advance, everyone would have scattered before whatever it was got within 20 feet of us, but none of us saw it until the last minute. Fight or flight was definitely not triggered in any of us, and we just stood there staring at this thing wide-eyed. "Holy crap," someone yelled, even before anybody knew what it even was. The dog-like creature then stopped in its tracks and turned its head this way and that way, looking each one of us over, almost as if checking to see whether we were a threat or not. I believe everyone there could see that the dog thing was nothing that any of us had ever seen before. It almost looked more like a joke or an apparition than any dog alive in our modern world. A dog from another time and place, or a mutated creature. That would be perhaps the best description of what we saw. Something so completely different, but we still couldn't help comparing it to a dog. But it was taller than a dog, and it stood on two legs and was covered in what looked like fur or maybe short hair. Its body was vaguely dog-like, but without much detail. The shape of its stomach at the base of its rib cage to its hips was dog-shaped, but spindly long legs and dog paws. It had a dog head with 2 ears and large dark eyes spaced widely apart on its brow. So many questions were going through my mind. Half of me was thinking it was just a joke and then trying to rationalize that this was some sort of a wild dog or a coyote. And then I realized that I stood there facing it about 20 feet away, still in total disbelief as to what we were all seeing. Some of the other guys finally screamed in fear for us to all run, and then all of them went running back to the house, leaving me alone facing this thing. I couldn't move, but I knew I shouldn't try to make any sudden moves because that might make it attack me. It slowly bent down and picked something up off the ground, and then it began walking in my direction. I was still too scared to move. I guess I thought if I didn't move or make a sound that maybe it wouldn't come for me. I don't know why. That just seemed like a good idea at the time. It took slow, deliberate steps towards me, but the scary thing was that it moved very quietly, like there was literally no sound at all. I became more terrified as each second of its approach ticked by. Its face was scary, and it had scary-looking dog-like ears, and it just kept coming right towards me until finally it was standing about 2 feet away from where I stood, frozen, standing there staring at it. This dog thing just stood there looking back at me, and I wanted to run, and I just could not move my feet. I was terrified, but a strange calmness came over me, still thinking that the dogman wouldn't hurt me if I didn't make any sudden movements. And then it bent down again, just like before, and picked something else up off the ground. And that's when I noticed that it had 2 hands, more human and less dog-like, with fingers on each paw, not like any dog I've ever seen. I remember thinking, dogman, dogman, dogmen. Maybe there were more of them out in the woods, and they were going to all come and kill us. I was gripped with fear that I wouldn't live through this encounter for sure. And that's when the dogman looked at the thing it had picked up off the ground and just kind of tossed it into the grass near me. It just stood there, staring at me, open-jawed, like it was ready to pounce on me and tear my throat out or something. And then it tilted its head back a little and made this sound that was so bizarre that I swear it was like a dog growl, but with low frequency. More like an ugly dog or a dog that I had never heard before. It moved another step closer to me while still making this strange growl, and I remember trying not to move, trying so hard not to be scared. I looked down at what it threw at me and saw dog hair and dog drool all over the thing. I stood there staring at it, tears streaming down my cheeks, so scared that I couldn't even take another breath. And then I realized with horror that it had thrown the remains of a rabbit at me. Was it telling me that I was next, or something else? Its eyes glowed in a way that I think it was talking to me, but I couldn't understand anything. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the dogman took one last look at me and turned and left and ran back off into the cornfield. I stood there crying for a few more minutes and then finally gathered enough courage to head back to the farmhouse porch where all my friends were gathered and waiting. I yelled at them, "Do you know what that thing was? It was a dogman. I swear to God it had to have been a dogman. Why did you guys leave me out there?" They all stood quietly looking at me, and then finally my friend Chris said, "David, what are you talking about?" "That thing we saw in the cornfield," I told them, saying it no louder than a whisper. "It was a dogman." My friends were all just staring at me, confused and scared looking, like they didn't know what to say. Like they had all made a pact to not believe what had just happened. And that's when Tom came up to me and said, "We didn't see anything. If you saw something, it definitely wasn't a dogman. It was probably just something that was hit by the car out on the road and found its way into the cornfield. Maybe that's why it looked and acted so strangely." "No," I said. "That thing came up to me after you all left, and then it threw a rabbit carcass at me. It even looked like it tried to communicate with me by doing something weird with its eyes." Tom said there was no way, and to prove it, he said we should all just go back into the cornfield and look. Of course, I was terrified, but they were all acting like nothing had happened, so now I was totally doubting myself. Like, why were they pretending that this hadn't even happened? Were they too scared? I went inside and grabbed a few flashlights, and we all set off on the same path into the corn. And when we got to the spot where it all happened, there was no sign of anything. No rabbit carcass, no disturbed corn stalks, nothing out of the ordinary. And now I really don't know what to think of myself. To this day, I have no idea if this really happened to me or not. Do dogmen cover their tracks? Can they really just disappear and leave no trace? Please let me know if you know of or have experienced anything like this. 6 years have now passed, and it still consumes me. I think my grandfather was right about the dogman. He was on to something. But why does nobody believe me?